So again, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Michael. And thank you everyone for having me here. I know it's a tricky time for a lot of people at the moment with COVID and so on. So I'm really grateful to have you all join my talk, and I look forward to meeting many of you. And I'm happy to answer any questions or follow up individually as well. And I'm really excited to share my work. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, for those of you just joining in, I'm an assistant CS professor at Virginia Tech starting this coming fall. But again, as Michael so kindly introduced, I decided to spend some time as a postdoc here at Stanford Computer Science as part of the NLP group. And for my current work at Stanford, I'm focusing on using NLP and statistics to examine linguistic patterns related to escalation in police interactions captured through body-worn cameras. And for this project, I work with wonderful people such as Dan Jurafsky from the CS and Jennifer Eberhardt from the Psych department here at Stanford. For today's talk, however, I'm going to be focusing on my earlier work at UCI, where I recently finished my PhD just last year. So I'll be excited to jump right in. If you're like myself or my friends, these days watching the news can be difficult, and talking about it online even harder, especially when it's about politics or social issues. And in fact, we are like most people here living in the US. According to a survey conducted earlier just last year, almost half of Americans have stopped talking about news related to politics with other people. And what's really interesting is that adults who are more engaged with political news are more likely to have stopped discussing social or political issues with others. And this is a real problem, because if we look back at history and how most democratic nations have evolved, people's ability to engage in democratic discourse, or the ability to access and interpret factual information and critically reflect and discuss important social issues, enables people to find common ground with each other despite having social or political differences. And this is crucial for democracies to function properly. It's what keeps governments accountable and brings society together. However, we all know that this is a real challenge today. About 67% of Americans report to feeling confused about basic facts around current events, while 70% report to having seen political news that seems completely made up. And furthermore, we have political extremism, making it harder than ever for people to talk to each other about important social topics and issues. And on top of this, thanks to technology, the way we access, interpret, and discuss information with others have significantly changed over the years. From watching televised news broadcasts typically in the evening, more people now are coming across news whenever and wherever in the course of doing something else. Another example is the display of information. In newspapers, professional editors carefully curated content by category of topic and length, whereas today people can easily come across news content sandwiched between advertisements, videos, or memes. Furthermore, while discourse primarily occurred through face-to-face interactions in the past, today online conversations around current events are often with strangers, known only perhaps by username or profile picture in a thread of thousands of other commenters. And in fact, on social media, there are many design features that are increasingly characterizing the conditions of how people come across and talk about current events. Take, for example, the infinity scrolling of content on newsfeeds where attention is calibrated in microseconds, or hashtags that amplify the visibility of popular or trending social topics. And we also have affective comments or emotive buttons that induce us to emotionally react to news content or even just observe how others do so. So clearly, the conditions in which modern political discourse occurs have changed significantly. And without really understanding how these changes are affecting the way we perceive and talk about important social and political issues online, it will be impossible to improve the online environment as an avenue for democratic discourse. So what can we do? As HCI researchers, we understand that the design of online spaces affects how people engage with others and interpret content. In a similar vein, in political communication, researchers have shown that the digital public sphere, or the conditions in which online discourse occurs, is said to be a key determinant of discourse quality. And as someone who kind of sits at the intersection between HCI, political communication, it's hard not to notice the strong interconnected link between these two fields. For example, the conditions in which online discourse occurs are made up of the various online design features that I've previously shown, such as hashtags, affective comments, emotive buttons, and so on. In other words, the design of online spaces shapes the conditions in which online discourse occurs. Second, discourse quality is something that we understand through how people talk with others and interpret content. So putting these two statements together, in other words, what both fields are saying is that the design of online environments affects discourse quality. But how? This is precisely the question my research focuses on. As a scholar and researcher, my work bridges the field of HCI and political communication, through which I examine and demonstrate how the current design of online environments shape the quality of online democratic discourse at scale. And in doing so, I take two approaches. First, I identify linguistic factors related to discourse quality, for which I often use NLP, machine learning, statistics, as well as qualitative content analyses. And second, I demonstrate at scale through empirical methods the direct impact of online design features on linguistic behavior through large-scale surveys and experimental design. And so far, using these approaches, I've examined how online design impacts the nature of discussion on race, class, and issues related to gender. And in today's talk, I'm going to demonstrate how political hashtags as a common online design character affect the quality of online discourse around current events using these two approaches. First, I'm going to show you how linguistic factors related to discourse quality, what words we use, how we use it, contribute to the divide in online conversations around political hashtags. And second, I'll demonstrate how the presence versus absence of political hashtags in social media news articles directly shapes the quality of discourse around social topics related to race and gender issues. So hashtags related to social issues or political hashtags are pretty much an inseparable part of online discussions around current events. In fact, designers and engineers have turned to political hashtags to increase participation in online discussion around social issues, typically by building systems that classify, rank, and attach the top most popular hashtags to articles based on the frequency of hashtags appearing in social media conversations. In a similar vein, journalists are also using political hashtags, as shown here, to increase readership and to contextualize reporting, especially on social topics. And this practice is particularly salient on social media, where news companies incorporate hashtags in the headlines or the text part of the social media article in these short, digestible previews. And for this tactic to be effective, it's pretty common for news writers to capitalize on political hashtags that are known to have gone viral and thus have broad resonance with current and potential readership. And according to Columbia Journalism Review, such practice is perceived as a good way to introduce a story or perspective into the mainstream news cycle and a way to figure out what the public wants to discuss and learn more about. Researchers too, for the most part, have generally taken a positive view of how political hashtags shape online discourse, emphasizing that political hashtags inform debate, challenge public perceptions around contested topics, and enable personal storytelling across discursive networks. So engineers are using them, journalists and news companies are using them, and researchers and scholars for the most part think political hashtags have a positive influence on online public discourse. Then, why are we extremely divided across issues embodied by political hashtags? For example, 1 year after the Me Too movement, reports now show that people's opinions have shifted more negatively against Me Too survivors. And according to polls, people are more divided on issues surrounding sexual harassment, with the divide running primarily along partisan lines. Likewise, the majority of Americans have an unfavorable view of Black Lives Matter several years after it first came to national prominence. And again, in light of recent events just last year, reactions to the Black Lives Matter hashtags have become even more complicated. So again, why are people becoming increasingly polarized around important and substantive social issues embodied by political hashtags? To answer this question, and given my interest in discourse behavior, I first turned to actual Facebook comments surrounding Me Too articles published by 3 very politically distinct news outlets to demonstrate how linguistic behavior contributes to this divide in perspectives around political hashtags. And here I focused on linguistic style and affect, how people talk about issues related to the Me Too hashtag, what kind of words they persistently used, how they used it, as well as the kind of topics they focused on. And finally, I examined some of the biases or framing effects that emerged from their linguistic behavior. So from the 3 Facebook news pages, I first identified all articles headlined with Me Too in the news post. And from here on, I'm going to refer to news articles published on Facebook as news posts. And I analyzed all the comments, including replies on each article. And here are the key differences I found. First, comments from the far left and alt-right news sites exhibited significantly greater use of profanity and words related to anger and sex compared to those from the mainstream outlet. For example, alt-right comments contain nearly 3 times the proportion of sexual words and 5 times the proportion of swear words compared to the New York Times comments. Far left comments contain nearly twice the proportion of such words compared to the comments from the mainstream outlet. And such difference in linguistic style, especially in terms of negative affect, is really important to take into consideration because research shows that when people engage in heuristic processing of political information on social media, negative emotional words induce more negative conclusions on what's being discussed. What this means is that if you have a flood of social media news comments charged with negative affect, this can create a strong negativity bias towards the discussion topic. And this is exactly what was shown in the data. These are TF-IDF results based on the comments from the alt-right and far-left articles on Me Too. And here I'm showing you the list of keywords in the descending order of TF-IDF weight, which I used as a proxy to examine topical importance across commenters. And as you can see, both Breitbart and Democracy Now! Commenters are topically focused on sex with frequent references to body parts. And not only were these commenters pretty similar in the kind of topics they focused on, but they were very similar in how they discussed these topics. Across Breitbart comments, sex had the highest TF-IDF weight, which means that it was a major topic that was often brought up. And in these comments, people often brought in strong prior beliefs or assumptions around the legitimacy of victim status in sexual encounters, which is why the word sex occurs a lot. For example, one commenter says, so you sleep around and then 20 or 30 years later decide that you were harassed or made to have sex. Did any claim rape? Did they have a gun or knife held to their throats? How does one claim they were forced to have sex? I'd just like to know. Across the far left comments, people are focused on race, denoted in this keyword color. And these commenters often argued over which race or class should be included or excluded in the Me Too narrative, as you can see in the following comment. Yes, women of color and working class women are especially vulnerable, but Me Too is primarily with regard to upper class white women. So these are some distinct linguistic patterns showing, what words people persistently use, how they use it, what kind of topics they focus on in discussion of Me Too across politically different Facebook news sources. And it got me thinking, what kind of framing effects can emerge from such conversational behavior? And framing effect is a form of cognitive bias in which people react to a given choice in different ways depending on how the choice is presented. In social linguistic research, there is a similar idea expressed by Firth, who argues understanding how a word is characterized by its nearby words can reveal key linguistic context in which it is discussed. So based on this premise, I used Word2Vec, which is a simple neural network model, to quantify the semantic proximity between the word "me too" and nearby words that co-occur with it to understand the potential framing around how "me too" is discussed. And I built 3 embedding models using the corpus of comments from the 3 news sources and found some key differences. Here, I'm showing you the top 25 word embedding tokens, most similar to the word "me too" based on cosine similarity values. And the cosine values here are basically the similarity of angles between each vectorized token and the word "me too", ranging from 1, denoting that they're identical, to -1, meaning that they're kind of absolute polar opposites. And as you can see among the New York Times Facebook News comments, "me too" is semantically closest with tokens such as hashtag, group, campaign, words that are intuitively characterizing "me too" as an online social movement or a hashtag campaign. For Breitbart, "me too" had strong semantic associations with whore and always. Whereas for the far left comments, "me too" was semantically closest with words associated with socioeconomic status, such as fame, money, famous, rich, and perhaps even Hollywood. So taking these embedding results, I conducted a qualitative analysis of all the comments that included these top embedding tokens and found that there was a strong in-group versus out-group dynamics in rhetorical behavior that kind of reinforced biases around how "me too" was framed and discussed. For example, Breitbart comments portray "me too" participants as whores and sluts who always have manipulative sex to advance their careers, exhibiting a form of out-group derogation, as shown in this quote. Because "me too" is about liars looking for profit and control, it's always the quote-unquote powerful males they name. And as shown in this example, commenters often used absolutist expressions such as "always." And the word "always" is a really interesting word in political dialogue because it's a form of rhetoric when used often and persistently is harmful for constructive discourse around moral and political issues that need to bridge a wide spectrum of opinions and perspectives. But throughout my analyses, I found that alt-right commenters consistently use such expressions when describing those associated with the "me too" movement. Alt-left commenters, on the other hand, exhibited strong in-group favoritism based on race and socioeconomic status. Commenters frequently argued over how women of color or low income deserved more attention within the "me too" movement, or that rich and famous women were unfairly hijacking the "me too" narrative from those who are more racially and socioeconomically privileged. For example, commenter from the far left news source reads, "The brutal gang rape of Racy Taylor is not comparable to the alleged sexual assaults that rich white women, oftentimes previously endured for fame and money, are fighting for in their new "me too" movements." And as shown, far left commenters are making these blanket statements around which group deserves more empathy, while we have alt-right commenters making sweeping assumptions about the definition of sexual harassment or the character of those who are coming forth about their experience using the "me too" hashtag. In other words, what we're seeing from this work is a lot of linguistic behavior based on generalized expressions that promote dominant viewpoints within the discussion circle while marginalizing minority perspectives. And again, this is harmful for democratic discourse because it discourages empathy and sharing, which ultimately lowers the chance to find commonality through shared experiences as people, despite having different political views. So by looking at linguistic factors related to discourse quality, clearly we can see that people's linguistic behavior, what words they use, how they use it, what topics they focus on, is reaffirming divisions and perspectives around how political hashtags are consumed and understood. But this could be just part of the picture. What if political hashtags themselves were part of the problem? To find out, I conducted an online experiment to examine whether and how the presence versus absence of political hashtags in news posts shaped audience reaction. In the previous project, I examined discussion quality across 3 politically distinct news sources under one design condition, which was social media news posts with hashtags. In the second part of this talk, I'm going to talk about an experiment in which I vary the design condition by examining both the presence and absence of political hashtags in news posts while keeping the media bias of the news source constant. So using Qualtrics, I designed an experimental survey in which I randomly show each participant a news post either containing or excluding political hashtags in the headline and the text portion of the news post. The hashtag condition on the left, as you can see here, was actually the version published by NPR. And for the control condition on the right, I excluded the hashtag in the post text, as well as a phrase "Me Too" prompts in the headline. And for the experiment, we used 4 news posts topically focused on Me Too and 4 on Black Lives Matter, giving us a total of 8 news articles originally published on the New York Times and NPR Facebook pages. And the selection of the articles was primarily based on whether the intended message of the article could be best preserved with just minimal modification of the headline and the text portion of the news post, regardless of whether there was a hashtag or not. So for each news post, there was a control and a hashtag version, as shown here. But we wanted to take this a step further and add a second experimental factor to reflect the reality of social media news articles that often contain affective, positive, negative comments. So I decided to add positive, negative comments as a second factor, giving us a 2x3 factorial design. And this resulted in a total of 48 news posts, one of which was randomly shown in the survey system to the survey participant who answered questions and left a comment in reaction to the one news post they saw in the survey. So through this experiment, I wanted to find out whether and how the presence of political hashtags in news posts affected the way people perceive news content, specifically in terms of both positive and negative reactions. For positive reaction, I asked whether participants found the topic of the news post was socially important and whether they wanted to know more about social issues pertaining to the news post. And in terms of negative reaction, I asked participants whether they found the news post partisan and whether they perceived the news content to be controversial. And to understand these positive and negative reactions as dependent outcomes, we asked people to respond to each corresponding statements as shown here using a five-point agreement scale. And this is what we found. When hashtags are included in news posts, people perceive the news topic to be significantly less socially important and are less motivated to know more about social issues related to the news content. And in terms of negative reaction, people find news posts more partisan when political hashtags are included and also find the news topic more controversial. And this got me thinking, since prior research repeatedly shows that hyperpartisanship is linked with less motivation to engage with social issues, and that the quality of democracy is partly the extent to which people are engaged with politics through social issues, I wanted to further examine whether this negative perception associated with political hashtags was a mechanism that drives, that explains decreased motivation for positive engagement around hashtagged news content. Hence, I conducted a path analysis, which showed that indeed, when political hashtags are included in news posts, participants find the hashtag news content more partisan, but this is also the reason why people perceive the news topic to be less socially important, as well as why they are less motivated to know more about social issues related to the news post. Similarly, political hashtags in news posts, which heightens people's perception that the news topic is controversial, deters people from wanting to know more about social issues related to the news content. And in fact, it's not just the politically conservative, but also the politically moderate participants who have strong partisan reactions to news content with political hashtags. Using kernel density estimate, I visualized the distribution of responses towards the following statement. The partisan undertone of this news post is obvious across 3 political groups. And the distribution of responses among those who identified in the survey as extremely liberal for both the hashtag and the control groups are left skewed, meaning in general, these folks tend to regard news posts about gender and racial topics from our experiment less partisan regardless of hashtag presence. By contrast, for the extremely conservative, the distributions are more right skewed, meaning that these participants perceive news content with or without hashtags as politically biased. So you can imagine, who did the political hashtags really affect in terms of partisan reactions towards news content? It was the participants who identified themselves as politically moderate. And among these politically moderate participants, those who saw news posts with hashtags perceived news posts as more partisan than those shown news posts without the hashtags, as illustrated in the shaded gap between the blue and red distributions here. And in fact, this difference in partisan reaction between the control and the hashtag groups among the politically moderate was significant with a medium effect size. So, political hashtags clearly affect how people perceive news content, both positively and negatively. And in terms of partisan reaction, hashtags particularly affect those who consider themselves politically moderate. Now let's take a look at how political hashtags affect the way people talk. Specifically, I want to show you how political hashtags shape the language people use in their comments in reaction to news posts that they saw in the survey. First, when hashtags were included in news posts, people used significantly more words associated with anger, fear, and disgust. And again, if you recall from my earlier study, we know that linguistic style and affect, especially negative affect, can generate a strong negativity bias around what's being discussed. Furthermore, when hashtags were included, people also used more language, predominantly focused on the hashtag itself, drowning out any reference to the main subject matter of the news post. For example, what I'm showing you here are the keywords listed in the descending order of PMI, or point-wise mutual information scores, which I used as a proxy to measure topical focus. And what you're seeing here is that when the Black Lives Matter hashtags are included in news posts, people tend to use language that is clearly focused on the hashtag itself. By contrast, those in the control group who saw the same exact news article, again, identical news articles, but without the Black Lives Matter hashtag, use language that are topically focused on the actual subject matter of the news content. And let me show you some examples of what these comments from the survey respondents actually looked like. Here, these are identical news posts, one version containing the hashtag based on the original news post, and one that has been modified to exclude the hashtag on the right. And going forth, I'm going to show you some results from the content analyses of the comments written by politically moderate participants from both the control and the hashtag groups. First, in the hashtag group, participants repeatedly mentioned the hashtag without substantially engaging with relevant social issues, as shown in this example. And when such discussion behavior is replicated on social media, this can amplify how much one is exposed to a constant yet substance-wise empty reiteration and assessment of the hashtag, resulting in linguistic behavior focused on the politics of the hashtag, as shown here. By contrast, comments from the control group showed that, ironically, the absence of the hashtags actually promoted the core ideas and values of the hashtag that was originally meant to represent. For example, a commenter in the control group who saw the news article without the #MeToo hashtag recognizes the importance of giving platform and voice to survivors of sexual harassment on social media and keeping track of these instances without them going unheard, which is the essence of what #MeToo intended to represent. And such reactions from the control group are really different from the commenters from the hashtag group, who often question the credibility of the news content, for example, by referring to the news article statistics as a load of crap, or that the figures on the news on the topic has been inflated. And as a result, leading them to think that the article was fake. By contrast, reactions from the control group were much more nuanced and subdued. For example, commenters remarked, "My first reaction is that these numbers are really high, or I find the information non-biased. Frankly, these numbers seem low to me." Another politically moderate commenter in the control group remarked, "I suspect that the numbers for men may be lower due to the stigma that men reporting sexual assault will be viewed as weak." So as you can see, respondents from both the hashtag and the control groups are reacting to the same details shown in the news post. However, the interpretation as well as the language used to interpret the content are vastly different. In fact, commenters from the hashtag group use more emotionally extreme expressions. For example, even those who seem to be in favor of the hashtag movement use pretty aggressive language to convey support for the movement. Another prominent difference, which was really interesting to see in the analysis, was the use of first-person perspective and how people grounded their arguments. For example, this is a news post that originally included the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and here's the version where we removed it. And when the hashtag was removed, people often prefaced their arguments in the first person. And these comments that I'm about to show you are redacted for the purposes of this presentation. I think kids these days should be, I think that the main problem, I think it makes some good points. I'm a firm believer that I think that discussing. And to me, this is really fascinating rhetorical behavior because in political communication, the use of first-person perspective and dialogue is pretty significant because it rhetorically anchors a discourse to the present moment of conversation, and it signals reflection of personal values into the reasoning behind one's words, and is an indication of cognitive processing as well as sense of authenticity, which are factors that are known to contribute to constructive social discussion behavior. Contrast this with, why don't all lives matter? Black lives absolutely matter. Black lives matter is a crucial topic. Black lives matter, so do white lives, Asian lives, Hispanic lives. And as you can see here, the language in these comments is less reflective, less personal, and less open to difference. And instead, the majority of comments are strong declarative statements that repetitively pivot around the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which leaves no room for conversation with people who might share different perspectives. And remember in the first study I told you, when we repetitively process a flood of negative content on social media where people process things through mental shortcuts, it creates a negativity bias and turns people off. And our research statistically confirms this. People who use Facebook more often, several times a day, are significantly more turned off by these hashtags compared to those who are on Facebook once a week. In other words, repeated exposure to political hashtags are turning people off, as expressed by this one participant who uses Facebook several times a day and was shown a news post containing a hashtag. Honestly, social media is generating something akin to false positivity or inflated enthusiasm. I am so sick of this. I am very liberal. I'm not racist or anything, but it's just too much. If I see another post on the internet about someone being a strong woman, I'm going to lose my mind. No one is benefiting from this. We are not really more informed. There's less information and more of the same opinions on the same side. Expressed in this reaction, false positivity, inflated enthusiasm, not feeling more informed and being turned off by the news is pretty much the sentiment that echoes the reality of what most Americans are feeling and experiencing in terms of online news consumption and political discourse, as I've mentioned in the very beginning of this talk. And what's contributing to this reaction is something seemingly simple yet pervasive as a political hashtag. This is why we need to examine the quality of online discourse in relation to online design features. And I make two arguments as to how we can do so. First, when we think about designing for better online discourse, we need to take passive consumers or non-users into consideration. And second, we need to take not just functional, but also intertextual aspects of design. And I'll break down what these two things mean. First, remember how I told you that scholars have generally taken a positive view of how political hashtags shape the online public sphere? Well, implicit in these studies is the assumption that hashtagged media is received in a manner aligned with the goals of the community using the hashtags to promote or debate a particular social issue in the first place. However, nearly all prior literature have focused on what I call hashtag producers, or those who explicitly use hashtags in posting online content. And this is most likely because of the common process of collecting data through API filtering of tweets or comments that include specific hashtags, which makes prior research to focus predominantly on hashtag producers. And right now, most research using social media data to understand the nature of conversations or discourse quality around social topics are based on such methods. And I want to argue that we need to rethink and evaluate how our methodological approaches are kind of limiting the way we understand online discourse. And as a first step, as shown in my work, we need to take non-users or passive content consumers into consideration. Because as demonstrated in my findings, non-users or those who are passively exposed to hashtagged content may not actually perceive or engage in similar ways to the hashtag producers. And this is important, especially because to affect change in social discourse and public knowledge around political issues, it's important that we are able to mobilize a broader audience that goes beyond passionate enthusiasts. In other words, impact needs to spread beyond those initially aligned with the movement. However, my work shows that politically moderate respondents, people in the middle, are turned off by political hashtags. And in fact, contrary to prior literature, my findings shows that in the long run, political hashtags may impede critical conversations around social topics, especially around social media news content, which are and will continue to be important public spheres of discourse. This brings me to my second point. To design for better online discourse, we need to take not just functional, but also intertextual aspects of design into consideration. Earlier, I talked about engineers who build systems using political hashtags as design features to increase participation and discussion quality. Well, most of these engineers are predominantly focused on the functional aspects of hashtags, which enable searchability based on the frequency in which hashtags appear across online conversations, which in other words are again putting an emphasis on hashtag producers and overlooking non-users or passive content consumers. Furthermore, the sole emphasis on functional aspects of design runs the risk of overlooking the intertextual nature of design features related to online discourse. And let me explain what this means. Intertextuality is a notion that text attains its meaning in relation to other texts. And I'll explain to you what this means using political hashtags as an example. When a political hashtag becomes popular or is in the process of becoming popular, the hashtag will be used in various ways through the written texts of millions of network users. And in that process, because any kind of utterance, including ones that contain hashtags, is by nature dialogic, which means that a word's meaning and power depends on what has been previously said about it, the hashtag evolves and gains meaning in relation to other texts, depending on how it has been used and what has been said about it. And this intertextuality allows hashtags to become hypercharged with an additional semiotic pool, as we have seen in my work. And this is why when designing for better online discourse, we need to think about the intertextual aspects of online design features. So as a recap, we're facing this problem where people's motivation and ability to engage in online discourse is negatively affected with the rise of fake news, misinformation, and political extremism. At the same time, we also face a challenge where the conditions of online discourse have been significantly changing over the years. Yet so far, the conventional approach to understanding the nature of online discourse has focused on content producers, while the connection between online design and discourse quality has yet to be explored with depth. To this end, my work empirically examines the relationship between online design and discourse quality through various mixed methods and take non-users and passive content consumers into consideration. And in doing so, my goal is to provide a renewed understanding around how common online design features shape discourse quality at scale. And by deriving empirical insights, I aim to contribute to the theoretical implication of online deliberation and design research by bridging the field of HCI and political communication, both through methodological practice and theory. And finally, the way I see my research having impact is by informing better design and engineering practices for industry partners that operate our social platforms. And a goal here is to really take my findings as a conversation starter to build a serious dialogue, not just with tech companies, but also with journalists, policymakers, and activists. And hence, I envision my work to open up broader applications to other topical domains, which I can talk about in my future work if I have time. By the way, I'm recruiting PhD students for my lab at Virginia Tech. So if you're interested or know brilliant students, please send them my way. So I'll go through this very quickly. So as you can see from my work, I'm someone who believes that with better understanding of online design, we can increase our chances of improving the quality of online discourse, how we access, interpret, and talk about information with other people. And first, my immediate line of research focuses on understanding and improving online discourse quality at scale. And here, I'm really interested in identifying linguistic markers around affective, psychological, and rhetorical patterns of speech that can better inform how we understand good versus bad online discourse. And the motivation here is based on the fact that in order to improve discourse quality, we need to first be able to distinguish apart what constitutes factual, constructive perspective taking from, toxic, divisive, and misinforming linguistic behavior. But we need to do this in relation to online design. And this will be done through application of NLP, deep learning, on a repository of data collected through large-scale experiments. And for this part of the work, I'm really looking to collaborate with industry partners, especially on their efforts to reduce toxicity on their platforms. Skip. And second, I'm really excited to examine how audiovisual cues, such as images, tone, voice, facial expressions, captured in various sources of data from both on and offline interactions can be used to better understand how people talk to each other in various contexts. Hence, I'm looking forward to not only expanding the domain of interactions I'm examining, but also expanding into the different methodologies and approaches in which audiovisual cues can be analyzed in combination with text. And here, the goal is to understand how the various audiovisual design cues are not only shaping the nature of online interactions, but how they might be perhaps linked with practical real-life consequences, from election results to fundraising impact, job employment, and so on. And in addition, I want to explore the different ways we can leverage audiovisual cues and textual data together to better understand and improve the way we talk to each other in offline contexts, such as the work that I'm currently doing, looking at interactions captured through video footages of officers and drivers in traffic stops. So again, I'm looking for creative ways to partner up with industry and academic collaborators and look forward to working with bright students. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So this is end of my talk. I'm so glad I'm right under the time limit. You've been a fantastic audience and I'm very happy to take questions.
All right, thank you so much. So panelists, feel free to go ahead and just unmute yourselves and ask questions. In the meantime, I just sent out a link to all of the students if you'd like to submit Q&A to the link. We have a bunch of good questions already. I'll start with one or two of those and then we'll flip over to the panel. So One question was asking, is that, you found that conservatives found the articles about Black Lives Matter and Me Too to be partisan, regardless of hashtags, and that moderates found them more partisan when the hashtags are present. And they pointed out that Black Lives Matter and Me Too they felt that they could generally be considered to be sort of liberally oriented topics or hashtags. And they were wondering whether there would be similar results for conservative hashtags.
Yeah, so Me Too and Black Lives Matter are generally regarded as hashtags pertaining to a liberal political perspective. And that's why we wanted to include hashtags that resonated more strongly with the conservative political views, such as, A2, referring to gun rights, Second Amendment, and other conservative political hashtags. Unfortunately, for this study, we were limited in the sense that we were looking for hashtags that were used by mainstream media repetitively to frame the news content. And most of the conservative hashtags were not in mainstream news sources and the headlines. And a lot of these conservative hashtags tended to focus on specific people, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and so forth. So it really didn't capture the essence of the hashtag's role in framing news content. So that's why we couldn't look at more of the politically conservative hashtags, but that's a good point. Yeah.
Also, I was wondering if you have thoughts about how to go about convincing the stakeholders, like at the platforms, for example, to realign their efforts toward quality political discourse over just increased participation. And she points out that hashtags often serve a purpose for the platform's monetary or user data goals that's hard to push back on. So what do we do? What are we to do about this? Absolutely.
That is such a salient point. And talking to industry researchers from Facebook and Twitter, there is a conflict of interest in terms of how the platform operates to generate revenue versus managing the quality of conversations that take place there. And that's a tricky. It's really not easy to have that kind of conversation. But a starting point is to have this discussion started and increase awareness around how hashtags are affecting conversations, aside from their functional purposes and their functional necessity in operating these platforms. If there is a way to leverage, different design mechanisms to give people a better awareness about what's going on with these trending hashtags, that would be a start. And I recall from one of the conversations I had with someone from Twitter is perhaps there could be a way to visually indicate the polarity around the hashtag that is trending. But I think the starting point is to really have that dialogue and increase awareness around how hashtags can impact conversations. So yeah.
Formerly at Stanford, now just a member of the community. It seemed like in your conclusion slide for the real world implications, you said something to the effect of journalists and others should consider these results as they're figuring out how to word things. Whereas a takeaway I got from your data was maybe you should consider not using them at all.
Yeah.
Why is that not the conclusion? Where is there some argument for using them?
I think so. These hashtags embody really important social topics and issues, and it is a mechanism to facilitate conversations around especially difficult and challenging topics. But at the same time, as shown in my work, it does create a strong bias in the attitudinal reactions towards people who come across content that are hashtagged. And I'm not necessarily arguing to ban all hashtags together, because depending on the way it's used, there are so many different contexts that just can't be generalized. But when I spoke with several news writers, they really didn't have too much, surprisingly, they didn't have too much awareness around how the hashtag can impact the way their news content is perceived. Whereas some people are more aware of the attraction and volume they will get if they use popular hashtags. So there's a range in awareness across journalists and news writers as well. And I think one way to really start having this conversation around what the best ways to use or perhaps not use hashtags in news content is to ground and increase awareness across news writers and in the journalism industry as well.
I've been wondering, what do you see connections between the use of hashtags and then in political communication notions of how positions basically get branded? So like the terms pro-life versus pro-choice and so on. And are they serving similar sort of signaling roles? Are there differences? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, are hashtags branding more than their communication?
Yeah, that is the argument that I'm making. I think while hashtags are very powerful in the power that comes with hashtags, it increases reach of audience rapidly, but at the same time you're squishing all the different complicated facets of a complex social topic into one keyword, into a soundbite, and that doesn't facilitate conversation in a constructive manner, especially when the topic of discussion is polarizing to start with. And I agree. It is. It has strong similarities in the way key phrases are in political campaigns or political advertisements. Like keywords are thrown around just to increase noise. And yeah, so there is a strong similarity there.
We have a ton of student questions. For those of you who I'm not selecting, please keep submitting in future weeks, and I will do my best to work my way around. I was wondering, how do you think the name of the news outlet itself affected the thoughts? So, is it possible that regardless of the hashtag or its lack of hashtag or the comment valence, like the response would just be the same because, I look at Breitbart and I react a specific way?
So if you are referring, can I ask you a follow-up question? Is the question in regards to the first half of the study or the second half?
I think they were referring to the experimental manipulation.
Right. Yeah, so when we were designing this experiment, we thought about a range of news sources to select, but and then decided to narrow down to mainstream, or what other people would view as more mainstream liberal, mainstream left news sources, to reduce the inflammatory way of some of the headlines were using hashtags in other media, other news outlets. So that's why we narrowed it down to the two news sources. But yes, that is one limitation that I do take into consideration. But to be consistent with the news media bias of the news source, I decided to be consistent with the choice of news sources to continue in continuation of the first study as well.
Awesome. I think we're about at time. I will encourage those of you, if you want to engage with Eugenia further, drop her an email. I assume they can Google your name, find your contact info.
Absolutely.
Great. So yeah, let's all sort of thank Eugenia one more time for joining us. Do this sort of quiet clapping that no one can see. If you don't have your video on, or if you're just an attendee, then, I don't know, send excited bits through the internet or something. So thank you so much for joining us. We will end here.